record repository is referred to as ELRR. So to hear me speak to the ELRR capabilities across this conversation, at the very highest level, it's a capability that allows us to aggregate the summit of information, not just of training systems, but also human capital systems, performance lifecycle systems, and then, of course, learning and development systems that capture granular information on training and education activities. And the hope for this is really to be able to provide a structure, from an IT capability perspective that's able to capture the learning and development data points across a life cycle, right? A whole learning and development journey that may take place exclusively within DoD, but also may exist outside of the DoD system bounds. And so the hope is, as we talk through the underlying reference implementation and then the progress that we've made to date, that we're starting to build that interoperability so that folks at all levels, not just the learners, but also managers across the enterprise, have insights in the type of learning and development activities that take place across individual careers and journeys. Before I jump in and get started, just as a reminder, sending out the agenda just a few minutes ago, we'll push all the Q&A to the back end of the presentation. However, at any point, if you have a question about a specific thing that we're reviewing, you can type in a question into the chat box within Teams, and then I'll be working to make sure we have a set of questions that we can go at the end. And then, as another mention, we are recording this session so that we can review and replay it for those stakeholders who may have missed it. So Daniel from ADL has already started that, and I'll go ahead and get started as a result. Before we jump into, I'll go ahead and introduce myself and my colleague. My name is Eric Flamer. I work for Deloitte Consulting. I'm a senior manager in our government and public sector practice, and I'm the project manager for this ELRR project initiative. I'm joined today by my colleague, Ajoa Dusepoku, who served as the technical lead for the ELRR prototype. So I've talked about a capability and framing ELRR as a way to really be able to provide persistent reconciliation. So being able to capture data from a lot of different places across an organizational life cycle and across a career journey, and then be able to reconcile that data in a persistent fashion and in an aggregated fashion, such that we've got a rolled up set of records reflecting credentials, job information, and career information for an individual learner. And having that aggregated set of learner records at the enterprise level is going to ultimately improve decision making from a personnel and human capital planning standpoint. Another major element of the impact here is adaptive instruction, thinking about how we can observe across training events and across various points in time in the performance and development lifecycle. Data that's meaningful that we can then reuse to tailor or personalize instruction. And then finally, we're speaking to broadly the analytical insights that we derive from being able to observe all of these scattered, individualized data points at the enterprise scale. And it's going to help us to have a clear visibility and a method for being able to not just view across learners and learner data sets, but also view the various systems that learners interact with, so that we have an understanding and a way to track updates that are made on an ongoing basis, given the distributed system environment that we're working with here on this project and then all the other ADL projects. So I was hoping before we get started to just take a few minutes to try and quickly put some framing context around learner records and also help support the ADL's total learning architecture, data model, and reference implementation. I think it's critical for the group to recognize that what we're talking about here really is in the language of XAPI. So as we know with the XAPI standard for capturing information on activities, learning and development activities, we generate a system artifact based on that specific event. And events can vary by nature. Events can be observed actions. They can be groups of actions that come together as a single verb. And then they can also include inferring based on the logic that's associated with completing certain steps, certain actions that roll up into a larger framework. And that's a really important first point. As we've implemented learning record stores and the XAPI standard, we've started to move beyond just the noisy data that's reflective of those low-level events and starting to get to transactional data that we are using a couple different system components that already exist to help standardize and provide authoritative guidance in terms of the outcomes that take place once those individual events come together to meet a competency, a credential, or a skill framework. And so ADL has implemented a few supporting tools to be able to go from the transactional to the authoritative. One of them that the ADL team speaks to quite frequently is the MOM profile. That's the master object model, which is part of the TLA sandbox and deployed already. That helps the transactional statements really conform to a standard so that they can be used for authoritative tracking of competency and conferred credentials. And the other asset that we're working with is CAS. So that's the competency and skills system proper. So that helps us to track all the various competency, credential, and skill frameworks so that we can make use of those individualized transactions and then be able to obviously confer from a digital standpoint the outcome that's associated with having a competency conferred. The final thing to really consider is the fact that there are a host of other enterprise assets that really help to paint a broader picture around data related to the learner's identity as well as the system information and context. So, the benefit for us is working with different IPT members who might have this broad implementation for XAPI, but obviously are working with different systems, which then leads them to an authoritative record in their own right. The reason why all this is important is because as we started this project, we really were examining how we go from a local authoritative record after an implementation of an XAPI and work to aggregate, but not replace, those records to turn them into enterprise authoritative records. And the work that we're doing here within this enterprise framework here, we're really working to federate these various local authorities and then working to build in an enterprise learner profile that would help support this federation such that if John from Air Force were to go and take an activity or complete some sort of learning experience outside of Air Force, we would be able to capture at the enterprise level the data and consolidate it to make sure that it's reflective of John from Air Force, even if he completes the activity outside of the Air Force boundaries. Now, all of that is hopefully helpful as we start to talk through the work that we've done this year for ELRR. And I say that because there's a lot of back-end implementation of enterprise data services How we frame the project, though, is to make sure we balance that back-end implementation with user value. And we want to make sure that we're driving at progress sort of as a vertical slice so that our IPT members and other interested organizations or agencies who might want to adopt the capabilities that we've built have something to see and can interact with in order to begin the adoption process of both the back end and the front end capabilities of ELRR. So that naturally took us to thinking about a human-centered design approach to the personas that would be interacting with the ELRR capabilities that we were prototyping. The first one is the most obvious, and I sort of mentioned it already, that we're talking about capturing data and presenting data on a learner's learning and development journey. And so all of us are learners. And consequently, from a persona standpoint, we're really talking about finding a way to be able to track all of our learning and development data and think about the impact that that has in terms of the credentials that we earn and the competencies that are conferred to us. So finding a way not just to replace an existing LMS locally, but be able to summarize across organizational bounds the full DoD set of activities that a learner go through across these organizations, and then in the future, maybe even externally. We also know that a huge impact for the ELRR capability will be those decision-making features and the analytics and the power of the data at the enterprise level. And the second group of persona group that we reviewed were the managers. So obviously managers are going to take different shapes and form, and there are a couple different sub-personas within this larger manager bucket. But we're speaking to those managers who are involved in the personnel development, whether they're a supervisor or a trainer, or if they're a planner as well. They may be part of assessing to make sure that we have sufficient personnel and that they have the necessary skills and training to accomplish the mission. And so this data is going to be vital for them to make a decision as to how they deploy their personnel and what learning and development activities their personnel may need to fill a gap. Final persona is not a human-based one, but I think is still really important to approach from a persona-based framework, and that's the machines. So once we've put in place the systems and sort of the underlying business use cases for learners and managers, as I mentioned, there are opportunities to use the aggregated data to facilitate a whole host of transactions, specifically adaptive learning and recommendations. And so from a machine persona, we're talking about the various pathways to be able to really bridge communications between various record systems and third-party softwares, which impact then learners specifically. Two specific call outs for us as we think about this federation of data. The first I've mentioned already, it's the enterprise profile. It's essentially a credential, or really more like a wallet, so to speak, for somebody's identity that tracks persistent data and is reflective of the status of the competencies and the skill frameworks that they may have at a given point in time across the various local sources of authority. And then the second one is the learner API. So once we've built all this out, we should have APIs to be able to synchronize and communicate with this aggregated record set so that we can make use of that data in a host of use cases, as I've mentioned, both are to either to facilitate adaptive learning, but also maybe to synchronize a learner record, or maybe even facilitate reporting and business intelligence. So that takes us now to the progress that we've made and what we're going to showcase in the second part of this presentation in just a few minutes. So for us, the emerging features that we've built out in this MVP cycle are as follows. We've focused from a learner perspective to deliver on a vision of an enterprise transcript. So a way that you'd have a portable document that would be able to demonstrate all the various courses and competencies that have been conferred from across the enterprise. That's going to require an enterprise learner profile, which we'll speak to as a component. We focused on courses and competencies first. So we've also built out capabilities related to course reporting and competency reporting for managers. There's a lot involved in the back end, as I've made mention to already. And so the core of the application development has been in building these data streaming services that allow for the movement and the detailing of the underlying data that we capture that comes from the local sources of record. I mentioned also the Learner API, which facilitates queries to the aggregated record repository, and we've spent some time building out that component. We've also made sure to build out system administration tools in order to monitor the deployment. And then on the DevOps and DevSecOps approach, or from that perspective, we've built two elements that go into all the other services that we've developed. The first one is scalability. So using container orchestration tools in order to build an avenue for scaling up all the underlying services for ELRR. And then finally, we've also had success with one-click deployment packages. So thinking about how we develop services that are cloud agnostic that we can deploy to different environments, whether they're AWS or Azure, being able to have those deployment packages within our cloud environment, hopefully will accelerate adoption as we continue to further enhance these MVP capabilities that we've built out. So just to put all of this in perspective and catch those of us who were not part of the ride here so far, we've spent the last 11 months really driving at an MVP, a vertical slice of the original requirements that were provided to us at the beginning of this period of performance last year. We started with the TLA requirements for the Enterprise Learner Record, and we explored a range of existing activities, methods, and tools that ADL has been shepherding that really span so much of the work that ADL does outside of this ELRR project. I'll make mention to some of the other efforts. As I talked about a few minutes ago, a big one was the MOM profile. So the master object model standard for XAPI statements. We interacted with DataSim, which is a tool to generate XAPI data sets for use in testing and evaluation. We worked with the various IPT members who were in different places in terms of adopting the full TLA. So we're able to get some insights in terms of lessons learned and also think about how we federate across various authoritative record sources. At the end, happy to report that we've developed a set of service-oriented components that we'll talk to in just a few moments that support the maturation of this enterprise authoritative event tracking and learner profile capabilities. And I wanted to speak to that, as we'll see in just a few moments as we go through each one of these capabilities. These are related to authoritative records. So we talked in ELRR about the ADL's deployment of the Enterprise Learner Record Repository, but a lot of what we've built out and what we'll go through today can be applied directly to organizational efforts as they adopt XAPI and look to be able to build capabilities in competency conferral, learner profile tracking, and obviously dashboards for data that are impactful for a couple different personas and user groups. The bottom line is we're taking the progress that we've made here this year and starting to plan for the development of an IOC. And obviously that's some way off, especially when we consider that we need some cybersecurity to monitor the underlying PII that's inherent to everything we've talked about so far. And then also we need to think about our accreditation from a hosting and application standpoint. And I'll get to that at the end of the presentation and the final part of the presentation, but we're making good progress and have updated guidance and direction from ADL as to how we'll be approaching those key sets of activities in order to get to that IOC target. Okay, so that was a lot of abstract ideas related to both IT systems, but also hopefully some personas that are starting to emerge that I think all of us can probably latch onto, especially as learners. So let's talk through the workflow for ELRR, and then we can dive into showcasing the progress that we've made through this period of performance. So we start the workflow with those local authoritative repositories for the records across different organizations. And in the case of ELRR, we would be pointing to those authoritative systems. And then we have extraction agents that are automated and can be scheduled that pull learner records from the local source system and then synchronize these incoming records to prepare them for further modification in ELRR. The further modification is the hard work of something that we're calling the data fabric. So that data fabric for ELRR is a business logic where we can interact with various other systems that provide information, more detailed information related to identity, metadata on the course or the experience, metadata on the competency or skill framework, metadata on HR information. And those agents within ELRR are working to take that base authoritative learner record and really turn it into a more robust record that is able to demonstrate this evidentiary chain of development across organizational bounds. So now that we've got those aggregated records within ELRR, we have a set of portals, front-end dashboards, where both learners and managers can interact with and get information on the status of their underlying learner profile, but then the aggregated records as well. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, our primary focus in this MVP period was building out the courses and the competencies. So being able to display those two major features with regards to our dashboards. But we do recognize that in the future, in the near future, we would also want to account for goals or tasks, assigned tasks that match similarly to courses. And then on the competency side, we'd also want to expand to credentials and skills and badges. So all of those would come together in this front end where a learner or a training manager or a career manager would be able to get information on the status of those aggregated enterprise courses, activities, and competencies. Final piece to call attention to, obviously, is the learner API or the machine persona. So once we have those aggregated records in ELRR, we can provide interface controls for external applications to be able to communicate with the aggregated records and then gather information on those records as needed. Right now, we're going to showcase it's a very sort of one-off or point use of the Learner API, but this really does provide such a broad avenue for underlying use of the aggregation of learner records. Obviously, we want to make sure that any communication across systems, meets very stringent cybersecurity processes and has the appropriate levels of control built in. From across the workflow that I described, that's a common theme too. So this was a very high level or generic working of the workflow, but obviously recognizing that across these application and data services, there's quite a bit that's going on, and then there's quite a bit of control that we have in terms of what we display and also what we manage as we pull these records and aggregate them at the enterprise level. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead. Oh, before I do that, sorry, before we jump into the demo, just to summarize everything I've spoken to so far and give insights into the technology decisions that we've made. On the left-hand side, you'll see really our solution components that we've built out. I mentioned we built out extraction agents, and then we've got data services for really staging. So as we pull authoritative data locally from various local repositories, we almost have to store that in a way that we can make it accessible for the future business logic and future transformations. We've got that consolidative set of statements. We obviously work to have that conform to the MOM standard so that we're not just importing noisy data. Consequently, we're using a service to manage the routing of these various records into partitions based on topics. And this is broadly using a similar approach to ADL's use of Kafka, which is one of our technologies that we have highlighted here on the right. And then the work of the microservices really is to have different business rules at a smaller scale, interact with the different systems that are in the data fabric so that we're able to enhance the records and then ultimately render those enhanced records for access through the dashboards and the reporting features that we've talked to so far. As with all projects right now from the ADL, we're working to implement DevSecOps practices. And the hope here is that we can push for solution portability across cloud service providers, but also give ways to interested parties and adopters to contribute by adopting just a portion of this or all of this as well. So we've got packages for individual components and then for the full build that are available that I'll speak to in just a moment. The technologies that we've picked as part of this project, I've made mention of Kafka, which is our data streaming service. We're working with a J2EE framework, so working within Java, and we're also working with a Postgres SQL database. The reason for the PostgreSQL is trying to rely on open source, and we've tried to do that across the board here. There is a direction from ADL's perspective, and I'll speak to this at the end, that we should also be accounting for the possibility of moving to a linked data model with a graph database. And so a tool that we don't have reflected here, but that we've been planning for is Neo4j, and using that as a way, obviously, to structure our aggregated records once we've passed them through the data fabric. From a front-end technology, we use React.js. And then another major feature of what we've built out is Kubernetes. So Kubernetes is a service container orchestration. And the reason why we use that is to scale over time so that as we add local repositories, as we dramatically increase the amount of records that we're pushing through all the services that I described, we're able to ramp up and ramp down from a performance standpoint, and basically make sure that we don't crash our ELRR capability by feeding it more data. On the DevSecOps side, I made mention about pushing for solution portability. We've got Jenkins in terms of build and code integration and build management. And then just like the other projects that ADL is working on, we've got Docker for virtual containers for an AWS deployment. And then Deloitte has found a lot of success working with Ansible and Terraform to start to build in infrastructure as code. So being able to write scripts for the deployment of the cloud hosting environment and the containers directly into the code is something that should dramatically impact stakeholders getting to that one-click deployment feature that I mentioned in the beginning here. And we're very excited by the progress that we've made, obviously, in that DevSecOps realm. Taken together, though, we do recognize that there's quite a bit of work that's going to need to go into the hardening and accreditation of what we've built out. And we're looking forward to next steps on cybersecurity, both from an application development standpoint, but as I mentioned, also from a data model and a PII and privacy standpoint as well. All right, we're going to jump to the different components here that we're going to demo. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Ajoa.
So good morning. We'll start with the learner persona. So this is a login page. And so each one of the roles will have this information contained on the pages because, as Eric had mentioned earlier, they're all learners. And so this is an example of one. This is Alice. And the left-hand panel will show the courses that she's completed within the last 6 months, and then any competencies that have been conferred upon her. And we can also dive a little bit deeper into the courses that she has, as well as, and then on each of these pages, so both for the course and for the competency, one is able to export and have a PDF view of the courses that have been taken. Next, one can also see her competencies, and the same thing with this as well. These may also be exported. I think, Eric, you wanted to talk more about the personal information later on in this. So I'll leave that for later.
And I think the only thing to highlight too, we didn't show it, but we also implemented a link to the enterprise course catalog so that learners would be able to navigate directly to the ADL's implementation of the course catalog, just further helping people to find experiences that they may need as part of their journey. Before we jump to the next one, Ajoa, if you can jump to the presentation so we can talk through or recap that learner dashboard. What I was hoping we could do here, we just went through some of the features that we've showed at other bi-monthly DSR briefings. I wanted to recap here just for the group, and we'll take this similar approach for each of the 5 components that we have here. Based on what we've built, which is a way to track courses and competencies for a learner, be able to view them, then generate an output really as a transcript. We have a few features that IPT members can think about adopting out of the box. And I was hoping just for each of these components, we can talk through that as we toggle back and forth between the various elements that we're demoing. For this learner dashboard and report, we've got a set of front-end services, in React that partition the data in the way that, that render the data in the way that we just saw. So that's an opportunity or an avenue for adoption for stakeholders as they think about how to make use of this authoritative data. We do think that there are some opportunities for enhancement from what we've built out already. In the case of the learner dashboard, we took a first pass on the type of data attributes that would be most impactful, and it was pretty limited. You saw, I mean, it was really just the name of the course or competency, when it was conferred or when it was taken, and then the accrediting organization. But there are ways to build in other data attributes that would be displayed. This was a pretty basic reporting view too. So there are opportunities to build other views and lists within this dashboard. And then a final idea here for enhancement. We've got a pretty basic format. We got two formatted files, CSV, but also PDF. But obviously, we could work as a team to think about, what a universal or common format might look like for a transcript that might be able to meet the needs of a learner to be able to then go demonstrate their competency or any other items that they're looking to show from this aggregated set. All right. So, Ajay, I think we can actually jump to the learner profile now and talk through that.
So when we say the learner profile, we have, I'll actually use the training manager as we go through this, as you still have the same personal information. You have personal information, the organization, and the employment history. And I know this has been an area of conversation as far as the employment history is concerned. But all of this, including the courses that the person has taken and the competencies, that's all part of that learner profile.
And if you jump back to the personal information, the actual profile, Joe.
Sorry. I beg your pardon.
This is based on the draft ELR standard that Brent and team have been shepherding and working on. And this is just an initial set of attributes that we've plugged in based on the prototype scope. Right away, what jumps out is, it's a limited set of information. It's also information that may or may not be useful or impactful for a learner. We've got flexibility to change what this looks like. We did also want to capture, obviously, some of this HR and employment data, and we've tried to limit that here based on what we've represented from an organizational standpoint, and then from an employment history standpoint as well. So, the bottom line is this report is really reporting on the tracking within the enterprise learner profile, and then rendering some of the fields or attributes that we found that we would want to use to track the learner across the enterprise.
I would just point out, Eric, that is a very, it's a small subset of the total data model, just to kind of show a representative number of data elements across the different types of data that we might be collecting. So when we talk about employment, there's a lot of discussions in different standards organizations about how position descriptions can be broken down into competencies. So certainly that would play into the bigger picture of how this data might be used, especially when we start thinking about artificial intelligence or machine learning for career management tools and whatnot moving forward. So
great. Actually, that is a good segue to jumping over to the slide on the profile. So as we talked about just a few minutes ago, I mean, this enterprise learner profile, and it's really the data framework, is something that can be used, from an authoritative standpoint as well. And Ben, I did notice your question as we were transitioning to the demo. I noticed your question around getting to local authoritative and being able to push up and track persistently identity and the local profile just within the Navy layer. So, reviewing the work that we've done here, I mean, we've got it for the enterprise deployment, but it certainly would be relevant for review and then impact for each of the stakeholders here as they continue to mature their own XAPI and learner record systems as well. As Brent mentioned, broad opportunity for enhancement based on this initial capability, really just to refine the data attributes and kind of pick which ones we find to be most important, based on the standards that we have, but also what an organization might choose to adopt and implement. One thing that came up when we were building this out and demoing it immediately was making sure that we've got the appropriate privacy controls as part of a broader effort to accredit this and have this be appropriate in terms of who has access to what. Just to note, as a reminder, based on what we've built out so far, no manager is actually accessing any PII, any of the data attributes that we showed in the local profile as part of their reporting views. So we have sort of built in a way to render that data, but in the case of the manager reports, they're not seeing any specific information related to the learner. It's just the learner who's able to see that personal information. And then, as I made mention a few minutes ago, we're just working from the standpoint of storing course and competency information, but we'll be able to, with further work and enhancement, to also track and synchronize the status of credentials, skills, and badges. So it'll make for a much more robust portfolio, so to speak. And I'm going to take the maybe the direction that we spoke to over the last few months, that maybe it'll end up being called the enterprise learning portfolio, because it really is representative of an individual's portfolio of activities across organizations that's presented here within the ELRR capability. So, Joe, and now we can jump to the manager persona and dashboard.
So this is the career manager, and this is a role that's more of a subject matter expert who identifies the training requirements of a career field. So this role is more of the strategic role that plans for the readiness of a career field. And as you can see on the two leftmost panels will be that managers or the manager's personal information. So again, it's the courses that they have completed over the last 6 months, and then whatever competencies have been conferred upon them. And as we look into the learner's information, as Eric mentioned, it's an aggregate view of the individual learner's information. So they don't actually see anyone else's personal information. So here we have broad categories, and this can also be modified and changed as to what's the most useful to someone in this role. But we have the course name, the organization, where the course was taken, number of learners who completed the course, and perhaps ranks of those learners as well. There's a selection here for the organization. So if you were to do that selection, you'll see the courses from that organization, as well as down here when we have the competencies. One can search in particular competencies.
So I will mention here, I mean, this is a reporting of certain attributes, but trying to present like a balance sheet or a snapshot of where a work unit is, or where an organizational grouping is with regards to the courses and the competencies. And just as a note or reminder, this would obviously not just be broadly available to anyone to go be able to check on the various record, but would be using HR system data to obviously validate that somebody's has a manager role within that organization, and would be able to make use of this data to help evaluate the performance status of the work unit. And once again, we've got the front end services for what we've described, mostly for how to render or pass the underlying data and present it here in the front end. I think what you saw here was pretty minimalistic in terms of the title of the course, the number of learners, and the title, the course, the roles who are taking the course. So there are opportunities, again, to configure the data attributes that are presented and how we would make that impactful for a certain organizational manager. There's, again, an opportunity to expand this. We want to try and limit the amount of reporting views we have for managers, because this is ultimately not like a business intelligence capability or reporting tool in its own right, but really a way to provide meaningful information at the aggregate. And that speaks to the last idea for enhancement. We'll get to this in the Learner API, but one of the challenges that I think we talked through as an IPT team, and I love seeing some of the stakeholder conversation here. One came from DAU with Sean. Ultimately, Sean was saying that you build a data model that's very granular and provides a lot of opportunities to report. But that might not be helpful to a manager. So we want to find focused reports for focused needs. And then, in the case of the work that John Rivera and team have done from AETC, there's a whole idea for the Airman Learner Record around reporting and analytics. And I think we all had an agreement that that would happen outside of ELRR. So this is about finding ways to use the underlying capability to enable organizations to have the type of impact from a manager and planning standpoint that we've talked about through the life of the project. And one way to think about it and frame it is to think about a Learner API or a service to be able to query records. So with that, we'll jump over to a video we put together. You want to talk us through the interface, the API interface?
Yes. So at the very top, they get what's actually highlighted. That's the request that's being made, and maybe been a little helpful if we had actually introduced this a little bit better. Apologize. So the Learner API, it's one way that we're using to actually synchronize the data between what's in the ELRR and the local system. So the request to be made from presumably someone from one of the local systems, just a way to synchronize that data at present. So again, what's been highlighted is the request that's been made. We have an ICD, which is it's an appendix of our architecture report. But there are two fields here that are mandatory. One would be the from date, and the other is the organization that's requesting from the data that's being requested. And the from date obviously will retrieve all the data from that date to the present time. Now we have additional fields that are optional, like an undate, and you can also select courses or competencies, and that will just limit the information that's returned.
And to follow up on that, go ahead, Joe.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, to follow up on that, also specified in the interface control documentation is error codes and what are the types of responses that you would expect to see and what you would do about them, just to reinforce exactly what it is we're querying and the information that we gather based on that query.
Okay. And what's highlighted here is the response. And so you have the header, and if one scrolls down, you can see the rest of the data with this response. A note on the header, we have the total count, so the total number of records that one should expect, as well as where you're starting from and the end count. So you'll actually know that in your response, these are how many records are received and how many more are left, if any.
We can probably jump to the back to the slide and talk about opportunities for enhancement. I actually think, as we spoke to in our final report for ELRR, I think the learner API, the machine persona, is very compelling and something that we should really look into, especially as we've talked about kind of a few times in the project cycle. My Navy Learning obviously is working through kind of the same idea and set of principles and framework for their adaptive instruction and tracking information that's contained in the learner profile. So, for us, what we see here obviously is documentation that's already in place. And then, of course, based on the application services that are deployed, a method to be able to tap into the aggregated learner record repository. But I think there are a few opportunities for enhancement in just multiple use cases. The adaptive learning is one, but one that persistently came up to across this project was record synchronization and who owns ultimately the authoritative record. I've seen some chatter here in the chat about what it is we're doing, how we're approaching this. Are we disrupting or fundamentally changing what exists at the local level? It would still be helpful to think about how we use this learner API to be able to synchronize and get information from that enterprise level capability for local use. And then I think this would take a lot of work, but another avenue for enhancement is referring to what I just spoke to with the manager dashboards again, thinking about how we might be able to build a data pipeline for accessing the aggregated records in order to be able to do custom queries or being able to import underlying data related to data on trends, right? So, number of competencies that are being worked on or credentials that are that have been conferred. Obviously, we'd be working to take out any personal information. It would be at an enterprise level rather than capturing a specific individual information. But that's another use case that I think really matches well with the manager persona, so that we can find ways to tap the underlying data source for assistance or support in human capital decision making and planning. All right, we got one final component to talk through, and Joel will take us through that.
And just one note, this is also a different URL. So the sysadmin actually accesses the system through a different URL. And once here, they have 3 panels. One's for system monitoring, import, and contact lists. System monitoring gives a high-level snapshot of the profiles within the system, some of the unique learning activities as well as competencies. And then on the left-hand side, you have the configuration. So we have a listing of the endpoints and how frequently updates or imports are retrieved from those endpoints. Obviously, all of this will be or can be modified, as to what's most useful to the sysadmin role. Sorry. Along with that, I'll jump over to the contact list first, because along with this, with those endpoints, we have an area here for contact information, and we have at this point a primary and a secondary contact, which should be associated with those, or could be associated with those endpoints. The last one is the import, and here is just a recording of the last records imported, and one will be able to see the logs to that as well. And if there are any failures or anything that's unexpected, we'll be able to view that as well.
And just based on everything you showed, I think the system admin panel, very important, obviously from a deployment and from an initial installation standpoint. But at the same time, what we grappled with was making sure that the system admin wasn't like the fail point or overwhelmed in the business workflow. So trying to approach the sysadmin user experience more as a monitoring, set of monitoring tools, so the system admin would be able to go in and quickly flag where there might be an issue to go drill into more detail elsewhere. And so that reporting and dashboard panel is reflective of trying to provide just enough information to then be able to go and work with a local stakeholder or a system owner to be able to fix whatever issue might be causing for the breakdown in the data pipeline from authoritative record to ELRR. The bottom line is, as we mentioned before, we've got the services, the front end services that are available. If you go back up one more, Joa, and those are ready out of the box. If anyone wants to take a gander at implementing, the full ELR stack, the system admin would provide really that initial support as you started to ramp up and import from various sources. We did talk about as a team maybe some other avenues for improving the system admin UX UI, thinking about being able to configure the data attributes for the learner profile that are deployed as part of ELRR, within system admin, and also thinking about potentially a way to do a query within the system admin panel for the aggregated records, similar to the learner API. So I'm just trying to remove that sort of back-end transaction to make it a little bit more user-friendly if someone was looking to pick out a single record or run a query similar to what we saw in the Learner API demo. So as I've done in previous presentations, I have just a few polling questions. So I posted the link. If you can respond at this address, the pollev.com/ericflamer829. Two questions first. One being, based on the MVP capabilities that we just show, which of the capabilities do you have an interest in adopting? And just sort of listed them out. The learner dashboards, the learner profile, the manager dashboards, the learner API, the system admin / adopting all of the ELRR components that have been built. You have an interest in multiple, you can pick that. And if you have an interest in none, you can also pick that as an option as well. Give everyone just a few minutes and it should populate here on the screen. There we go, starting to trickle in.
Thanks.
Give everyone just another minute here. Looks like by and large we've got interest in adopting multiple capabilities across of everything that we've showcased so far and talked about throughout the project. So that is good. Also happy to see that we have none. That might spur someone to put that in, but seems like what I was hoping to hear. I mean, I think the learner profile is such a persistent question, not just with regards to ELRR, but with regards to XAPI. So part of the reason why we tried to structure the demo in the way we did today was to showcase that there's some underlying value based on the work we've done to help adopt XAPI further beyond just adopting or signing up or deploying ELRR. So really happy to see the answers here. So that was the first question. The second question that I have is, which of the MVP capabilities that you saw today do you think would be the most valuable to enhance or further develop?
This was a trick question. Would you like us to develop, would you like to have cake or ice cream or pie or all of the above?
Well, I think it's a good one. It's great to pick all, but I'll just share my own personal perspective. I think the Learner API and really thinking about how we try to frame or define some of those machine learning or adaptive use cases. I really found that it would be helpful to just talk about them specifically and try to work to enhance that. I think the reason why I say that is we heard early on that obviously this is going to have a really significant impact for managers, but we recognized as a whole that ELRR was not really a capability to overtake any existing efforts. It also was going to run into challenges in terms of managing the underlying data, right? Because we're not fundamentally changing it and having it in a different ownership structure. We're just pulling information and presenting it based on a more granular data model. And so, when you put those things together and think of, again, the work that Navy is doing around adaptive learning, to me, I really see a lot of potential and impact for Learner API and thinking about how we make this, accessible from a machine or system standpoint.
So it looks like you're influencing the vote, Eric.
I know, right?
No,
But
I'm glad to hear that too, because I just wanted to add that the Learner API is a big part of what the IEEE's P2997 working group will be working towards as well. And that, I think, is what is going to enable the analytics and dashboards across a lot of different things. And so when I see things like learner dashboards or manager dashboards, I often don't think of those in the context of the ELRR. I think of those in the context of the data that the ELRR is pointing to and how other types of tools like career field management tools or adaptive schedulers or recommenders or any number of different HR focused systems might use this data. If that makes sense. And that's what the Learner API is going to enable. Other thing, I would put a plug out to the My Navy Learning team because they have the MNL API that we've been looking at very closely. And I think there's going to be a lot of synergies between what we've been doing with the Learner API inside the ELRR and the work that they're doing inside of My Navy Learning. And our hope is that we can kind of compare and contrast and take the best parts of both to kind of harmonize them and align those in support of the IEEE standards so that we are truly creating a capability across industry, the developer community, and the whole 9 yards, not just thinking of it in the context of an app or a system, if that makes sense.
It does, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned those things, Brent, because that's where I think that if we can state and frame those exercises, then the hope is that we can make progress together, recognizing that a bunch of these groups are making progress across the life cycle of everything that goes into this. I'm going to try and wrap up here with just some final slides that talk to where we're going next. Hopefully that'll give us 15-20 minutes for the Q&A that has already been bubbling across the session so far. So just a note, we're still in the process of working to deploy this into the TLA sandbox, but we're really close. A lot of it has been working to make sure that we've got our containers orchestrated and we got the right services that we're integrating with in the current TLA sandbox and enclave. But in the meantime, I think, lesson learned or a challenge that we've seen from this project is making sure that we've got simulated data for targeted stakeholder usability testing. So we've been able to generate a test data set, but at the same time, that's data set is not necessarily meaningful for all the different participating organizations here. And so in order to validate and work to validate a lot of the elements that we've built out here that we've seen folks find useful, really would be helpful to spend some time in the 2 or 3 weeks that we still have in the project cycle to think about how we might be able to put that data set together so that when we share this out to our stakeholders and broader audiences, the data is impactful and helps stakeholders validate what we've built. And that really ties into the KPIs that ADL has pushed forward to frame the development of ELRR. We mentioned a few times just the number of repositories, and everything we built is really to drive at incorporating repositories and linking to those local authoritative repositories so that we can capture learner records. And that's a big challenge for us right now. We don't have any live data. We recognize that a lot of that is based on our current cybersecurity posture and accreditation for the hosting and the application services. But the hope is that we can work as a team here in a group to be able to build through or cycle through building some meaningful data sets, which can point us in the right direction. And that takes us really to the last one, KPI on this page here, which is the time savings that are associated with the information that we're working with and the underlying data. So great that we've got direction on where we want to take this, but there's still some work to go as we build through this MVP capability and plan for the enhancements that we expect to make. And that's actually summarized here on this page. For us, there's some items that we know in the requirement set we still have to get to. That's one related to user authentication. So how do we bring in the CAC? How do we start to pull information that might come from that authentication action? As I mentioned, we also have to get to expanding beyond competencies into credentials and skills. We have to get beyond courses and expanding into goals, tasks, and events. And then finally, there's the whole aspect of the HR data system and other linked data. And ADL is driving forward pretty hard and significantly with linked data, thinking about graph databases, ways to facilitate the linking of data and the semantic linking of data. Just to summarize some of the enhancements that I've already mentioned throughout this session, talked about simulating data to demonstrate capability maturation, talked about access controls a few times. You're recognizing that we'll have to implement some sort of access controls. Right now we do role-based, but this has been part of a larger conversation. Again, ADL, thanks for the guidance around role-based and policy-based access controls. And we mentioned about the Learner API and also expanding our DevSecOps footprint. For us, deployment, I think, is in a better place and has more certainty around it than other times in the project cycle. I think ADL has provided the direction around the target environment related to Platform 1 and thinking about how we start to harden containers and integrate with hardened containers so that we can start the cybersecurity review process in earnest and move towards planning for an ATL. And obviously, the sooner we do that, the earlier we can build in these key activities to our development and enhancements that are coming next. As we're closing out the current fiscal year and the current period of performance, as I mentioned, we got that prototype release candidate that we've been working to integrate in the TLA sandbox. And then I still think we'll probably give some updates in the coming weeks as to when exactly we start on any updates and enhancements that are part of option period support. In the background, ADL is tracking to identity, credential, and access management. I think Dr. Schatz mentioned it with DMDC. And ADL is also diligently moving along a broader cybersecurity process, which would lead to some key milestones here in the coming year. The bottom line is we'll be switching over and starting to focus on thinking about IOC capability development as we enter into the option period support that we have under contract. Before we turn it over to questions, I'll just say to everybody who was part of this process, thank you. It was really a rewarding experience for the Deloitte team and Lingatech, our small business partner. And we're very grateful that all the different IPT members were part of this process, despite all the other initiatives and efforts that you all are leading in your day-to-day work. So again, thank you so much to the team. And with that, we'll switch over to questions. So we had some conversations, it looks like, Ben, in terms of CAS and thinking about the learner profile. And talking about sort of local records that are aggregated authoritatively. It looks like Ben and Brent was able to respond to those. Dr. Schatz posed the question really to verify. The idea is not to be the original or authoritative source of identity information, but rather be the linking mechanism to work with that authoritative source. And the answer is yes. What we're talking about doing is building the data fabric to interact with the systems or the enterprise assets that do contain the information. So really, we're sort of routing the information and tying it to other pieces of information that we're routing that relate to the underlying learner record. There was a nice call out for enterprise learning portfolio. Wish I had done a poll question on that. Then there's a conversation here around DAU, maybe linking AETC. And it looks like Navy is also interested in next steps. What do you consider the priority to further enhance or develop forward to meet most immediate mission needs? That was it's a loaded question, Jordan, but love it. I think for us, I think the key one is around privacy and access controls. And now that we've sort of built out a vertical slice or some sort of visual presentation, across a couple different personas, to be able to interact with a something like a user interface that presents the underlying data. If we can really work to refine those user experiences and think about how we start to layer in now the various controls and the various solution elements that we know we would need to get to an operating capability. And so I mentioned, authentication is one. As you start to think about security and access controls, hopefully that takes us to being able to access the HR system data, because we do recognize that HR system data is really important. And I'll elevate even DCPAS. I don't know if Pam is on, but DCPAS, we were in so many important conversations with DCPAS over this project, and thinking about how we could even just identify a single compliance course that might be taken across many different iterations, across many different organizations, but being able to use the underlying HR system data to flag who's supposed to take that course, and then, of course, have a reporting mechanism to be able to share that at the DoD enterprise level. I mean, that's like a really narrow use case, but it could save lots of hours. Right? I don't want to go so far as thousands of hours, but like hundreds of hours, I think would be a really good use case to be able to show. Of course, Pam immediately was pushing on access controls and security and usage of data. So I'm channeling my inner Pam here, as I mentioned, that might be a good place to start. And if you build to IL4, they will come. I think that's an axiom that ADL is espousing and pushing us in the direction of. So, that's going to be another heavy focus for us, is working to implement the application services that Platform One has to offer, so that we build in those controls that, to, I think, everybody's point, allow us to market this capability and really start to bring data into this environment to get to some of the outcomes and capabilities that we talked about in today's presentation. Got a couple more minutes. Any closing questions? Feel free to speak up if you've got one. You don't have to type it in.
I will just kind of mention it real quick. Say's last comment about wanting to see the ELRR working in situ and IL4 environment, and just to let everybody on the call know that is the direction we're headed. Moving down the path of Platform One, we're excited about this, and I think at the end of the day that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's not a train. We're actually going to have data being pushed, back and forth, and so part of that is, once we have it in this IL4, though, is we're going to have to really kind of rely on some of our stakeholders, like the Sean Millers and John Rivera's and Ben Irvins and Dennis Mills and others, to help us get the appropriate information exchange agreements and authorities to operate, not authorities to operate, but authorities to push that data back and forth, so that we can do all the operational testing to show this running and not using simulated data like we're doing now. So we'll build it, we'll get it accredited, and it'll technically be functional, but to get the actual live data, we need your help.
And I would follow up with that one, Brent. We showcased really along the way that data model is crucial, and coordination on the data model is important, but we've got flexibility in what we build. We've tried to build kind of across the board in our solution, the flexibility to adapt, and also to be able to configure to meet a range of requirements, not just for users and organizations, but also for controls and cybersecurity purposes. So the hope is that we can continue down that path, but I think I'm in agreement with you that the sooner we can talk about it and put a plan in place, and then kind of plan our project around that plan, then the hope is that we can get through some of the challenging obstacles that might present themselves in the process that you described.
Along those lines, and I think a lot of the folks here know this, but I'm going to be explicit. The ADL team has been already started working with the Air Force's Platform One, which is their DevSecOps environment. And so our plan is, over the next year, is well, hopefully sooner than a year, but certainly our plan is to go ahead and start to migrate this, the Enterprise Course Catalog, other total learning architecture components, CAS, and so on, to that IL2 dev and test environment, IL4 production environment. So to get that cybersecurity in place, to get that stood up. And so that's happening independent of this specific project, but it is already happening. So that's really exciting news. The other thing I wanted to ask is, all of our collaborators that are out there, Navy, Air Force, DAU, other folks, if I didn't see you, please help us. So the thing we need is, we really want to make sure that everybody's kind of migrating towards the same direction within the digital learning space. What specifically I mean is, if you see folks, in the Navy or, other organizations in the Air Force that are going off and making their own version of a learner record, or that we're not going to be interoperable with, please help us try to get everybody moving in the same direction. We don't expect there to be, one system to rule them all. That's why we're working on this kind of federated approach with an open architecture. But we do want to make sure that we're not getting duplicates or non-interoperable systems. Similarly, we could still use your help if you have, projects that are ongoing and they want to jump on to these projects, ELRR, ECC, or otherwise, versus doing something parallel. We could definitely find ways to do that, and I think it would be a win-win. So keep your eyes out for that too. Thanks.
Any other closing comments? We're Dr. Schatz, Brent, we're pretty much at time, and I left John. I make note of the connectivity issues. We can follow up on that one. But yeah, just opening the floor. Dr. Schatz, seems like you made your pitch here to bring others along, and really grateful again for everybody's work on this effort. It's been abstract at times and very complex, but I know that the team has made a strong amount of progress, and again, very grateful for all those who have helped us in this development cycle.
Yep, and I would point out to John that I'll reach out. Maybe we should do some testing to look at different platforms. I don't know if we're using the O365 version of Teams, but we can start to experiment and see what works to help reduce those barriers.
Yeah, I spent probably the first 30 minutes of this meeting helping people get connected. And so we have to reach this meeting through the back door of our system, because on the Air Force network, it's just not available to us. And so some people had some difficulty and never got through. And then again, if wherever you post that video, we probably don't have access to that either. So I'll let you know when you post that video if I can see it, and then I'll share it with those.
Safe link posting. We'll have to coordinate with Daniel, but we were
That'll
able to,
work.
yeah, we're able to get that.
I can get to SafeLink.
Yeah, so that's a way to do that, and Daniel and I will make sure we coordinate so that you have that.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, great. Well, looking forward to some of our final meetings here over the coming weeks, but thank you again, everyone, for attending today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Nice
Talk
work.
to you later.